I'm curious, Daphne, what your reaction is to Zuckerberg finally coming out and responding to Frances Haugen's allegations directly.
Well, so I'd start by saying I think Facebook is full of people like Frances Haugen. It is full of people who care very deeply about potential harms of the platform and who are working hard to correct them. And I think in Zuckerberg's message, he got one thing really right, which is that those people need to have the freedom internally to do research and to maybe make mistakes and share their findings internally without fear that that's going to become some kind of journalistic gotcha. So I do worry that in a way this will disempower those people. But those people also exist alongside executives who, according to reporting from the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere, have done some frankly disturbing things, like the executive in India who overruled the trust and safety team to leave up posts that incited violence because they were from politically connected people. And those impulses, the desire to really do the right thing and make the platform as safe as possible, and the impulse to seek profit and be politically accommodating or sensitive are always going to coexist inside the company. The question is how to strike the right balance. I'm not sure if Zuckerberg's message has reassured his employees that that's going to happen.
Let's take a listen to one of the moments from the testimony yesterday, where Frances Haugen outlines Facebook's problems and then describes the company as being trapped. Take a listen.
Facebook is stuck in a feedback loop that they cannot get out of. They have been hiding this information because they feel trapped, right? Like they would have come forward if they had solutions to these things. They need to admit they did something wrong and that they need help to solve these problems. And that's what moral bankruptcy is.
I'm curious, Daphne, what you think of this idea that Facebook may be filled with a lot of well-intentioned people who may be in over their heads. Maybe Facebook's problems are just too big for any group of people to solve.
Yeah, so journalist Mike Masnick called this the banality of hubris, that we are seeing in this report's problems that anybody who was paying attention knew were within going on with Facebook in some form all along. It's just now we have documentation of the details. And I don't think that Facebook alone can solve them. I think that with better transparency and better input from civil society organizations, from experts, from members of marginalized communities who have been reporting harms like this for years and years, we can arrive at better solutions. And having a whistleblower force that transparency onto them probably wasn't the optimal way to do it, but we need that transparency, and now we have a better idea what's going on and better opportunity for more input.
Would you say that Facebook is too big to govern or ungovernable? I mean, obviously Facebook is bigger than the biggest countries in the world combined. Is it just too big?
It is not too big to govern. It is subject to privacy regulations in Europe. It is subject to obligations to take down certain kinds of content in every country in the world, including the United States. What it might not be able to do is perfectly regulate all the online speech so that all the good things stay up and all the bad things come down. That's partly because none of us can even agree on what that would mean. But it's also because no government in history has undertaken to police people's daily speech in the way that we are asking Facebook to do. That's a monumental task.
So let's start with the U.S. government. Should the U.S. government do that? And if so, how? I mean, one of the most remarkable moments in the testimony yesterday was senators from both sides of the aisle agreeing they have differences, but those differences are minor compared to the issues that Facebook, they believe, is causing.
So I don't think there are a lot of great options for new top-down regulation from Congress saying what speech should be allowed on Facebook or how Facebook should amplify that speech. And this is because so much of the harmful or dangerous speech we're talking about is protected by the First Amendment. It might be disinformation, it might be hate speech, we might find it morally abhorrent, but Congress doesn't have the power to regulate it unless the Supreme Court changes its law, its interpretation of the First Amendment. What Congress does have the power to do, though, is to pass laws grounded in competition or grounded in privacy. And I actually think there are ways to get at these content issues by, for example, giving users more control over how their data is used and more dials and knobs to adjust what they're seeing in their Facebook feed. Or you could try introducing competition in the provision of content moderation on top of Facebook. This is something that my Stanford colleague, Francis Fukuyama, has called middleware, creating competition where users can choose to have a flavor of Facebook that prioritizes what their church wants prioritized, or a version of YouTube curated by Black Lives Matter affiliated groups. There are things we can do using privacy and competition to avoid having top-down speech regulation from Congress.
The leaked research from Frances Haugen also reveals a disconnect between Facebook's devotion of resources to the United States and to fighting misinformation and hate in English, and the resources it devotes to the rest of the world. And Frances Haugen pointed out that Facebook's technology is particularly bad when it comes to identifying some of these issues in languages that aren't English. How big a problem is that?
I'm so glad you're bringing that up, because it's a huge problem, and it's something that doesn't get enough recognition from the US Congress, unsurprisingly, but that is no surprise at all to civil society activists from around the world, or ordinary users around the world. People in places like Myanmar or Sri Lanka or Kazakhstan are getting an experience of Facebook that is worse than the experience of Facebook that you or I are getting. And that's both because of insufficient support, from employees who speak the languages in those countries, or the sometimes multiple languages in those countries, but also because of the difficulties in updating the algorithms to have the sort of greater safety measures that Facebook has implemented for English, Spanish, French, major languages like those.
Where do you think Facebook is headed if nothing changes, if no regulation is put in place?
Well, that's not going to happen. Even if Congress is paralyzed in the US, the EU is passing a major new law, the Digital Services Act. It will definitely come into effect. It will definitely reshape content moderation practices. It will require Facebook to do annual risk assessments and mitigation plans and independent audits. So change is coming no matter what. And this is one of the reasons that Facebook is running ads saying, please regulate us. Their sort of best case scenario of the future is if the US requires them to do the same things that Europe was going to require them to do anyway, and those are things that its smaller competitors can't afford to do.
So then do you think some of the sort of doomsday scenarios, there are a lot of people on both extremes of this debate, are they overreacting to what we've heard over the last couple of weeks through Frances Haugen?
I don't think they're overreacting. I think particularly if you hadn't been tracking these issues and all of the things that Frances revealed are news, then it is appropriate to say, hey, this is a big deal. We should do something about it. But in terms of what are our options going forward for wise regulation, they're about the same options that we had before. And there are always limits from the First Amendment on one side to what Congress can do, but also from just the operational reality of platforms on the other side. There's not a magic wand that anyone can wave and make Facebook moderate content in a way that make all of us happy.